Today we're going to start our study of the cells, which is called the study of cytology. Whenever you see a word end in O-L-O-G-Y, that suffix means the study of. So ending a word in O-L-O-G-Y means the study of. And when a word starts with cyto, or what cyto means, is cell. So cytology is the study of cells. This is going to be a series of lectures, and how we're going to start off today is taking a look at the basic functions of cells, different types of cells, different parts of cells, how many cells there are, before we dive deeper into the specific anatomy and physiology of cells. What we're looking at here is an electron micrograph picture of red blood cells. So each of these little red, kind of puffed out, kind of fat tires is a red blood cell. And you might be able to tell that they actually kind of have an indentation on the top. They actually have an indentation on the bottom as well. So when you look at them from the side, they're little biconcave discs like that, or like little barbells. And here's a picture on the kind of left of a side of a little RBC, or red blood cell, squished on its side. Here's a little food for thought during this presentation. Other than the fact that this is just a really cool looking picture of red blood cells, there's another good reason why red blood cells make a perfect poster child for cells. So that's just something to think about during the slideshow. But also, it's sort of an ironic choice to have red blood cells represent cells as well. So during the slideshow, you can think both about why red blood cells make a really good poster child for the study of cytology, and why they're sort of also an ironic choice. Cells are the building blocks of the body. You'll see a typical textbook definition of a cell, or description of a cell, is that the cell is the fundamental unit of living organisms. And people will sometimes compare them to bricks or Legos as the building blocks. But what does it actually mean to be the fundamental unit of a living organism? Well, cells are the simplest form of life that can exist as a self-sustaining unit. In other words, it's the smallest part of a body that can do the basic functions of a living organism all on its own. Another really common analogy is to compare cells to little factories. This little cartoon diagram, you've got different basic parts of the cell, the outside being the cell membrane, the inside, the blueprint, or the command center, being the nucleus, and then the various parts creating, manufacturing parts and shipping them with these little people. Although in real cells, I think they're actually Oompa Loompas. But if a cell is like a factory, and factories can manufacture or produce all kinds of different products, what is the product that cells make? Well, there's over 200 different kinds of cells, and they can do a lot of different cool things, but the basic thing, or the primary thing that the cells are creating is what actually creates the substance of the body. Can you think about what is the main structure of the body? Well, if you said proteins, you're correct. So the main thing cells are doing is producing or making proteins. Now, think about what kind of substances in the body are made from proteins. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people might first think about muscles, and that is definitely true, that a lot of the structure of the body, such as muscles, are created by proteins. A lot of other substances are also made of proteins, such as antibodies, part of the body's immune or defense system, hormones, which are the body's chemical messengers, digestive enzymes, and an enzyme is a chemical that helps break down other chemicals. So the enzymes, they can take food that you take in and help break it down chemically into small enough pieces to actually absorb, so the nutrients are actually usable and useful to the body. And other substances like insulin. Now, just talk really briefly. We're going to talk about all the parts of the cell in a few lectures in, but I'm sure everybody, or at least most people, have heard of nucleus, and probably most folks have heard of the nucleus of the cell having DNA. And probably most folks know that DNA acts like a blueprint. But beyond that, I think a lot of people sort of have a misunderstanding of what the blueprint or the DNA actually codes for. People may think about certain personality traits being created or coded for by DNA, or certain genetic disorders having a link to faulty DNA. But what does the DNA actually code for? Well, it actually codes for proteins. And so when the body each cell uses the nucleus as the command center, it's actually, the DNA is actually coding for which proteins the body's going to make. So if something has broken down in the body, let's say you've got some damage somewhere in the body, your little cells can make more proteins to repair that damage or create something new. And we shall be taking a closer look at that later. If we are going to take a look at how cells are the simplest form of life that can exist as a self-sustaining unit, we need to take a look at, well, what does it actually mean to be alive? What are the features or characteristics? What are the abilities of living organisms? And that if you took a little cell and isolated it in a petri dish, it could actually do those things. And then what kind of substances and things need to be available to do all those functions of life. So rather than think about the cell as a factory, which is a useful but somewhat limited analogy, I think an analogy that we can actually get a lot more mileage out of is to think about a cell like a goldfish in a bowl. And if that individual cell or that individual fish in a goldfish bowl is going to stay happy and alive, what kind of things does it need to do? Well, perhaps some of the first things you might think about is that it needs to be able to grow and repair itself, reproduce, move, things like that. If you think about some of these functions, one of the things that a cell is doing in order to get work done, such as the work of growth or repair, is it is actually going to need to transfer or convert energy from one form to another, or make useful forms of energy. And we'll take a look shortly at how the body actually makes energy. But let's take a look at, I think growth might be kind of obvious, but let's, as organisms, or people, like if you take a look at the bigger organism like people rather than the smaller, cell, you can see that, kids grow up, have to grow up and become adults. But let's take a look at repair. So anytime cells or machines of any kind do work, just like any machine, they're going to break down. They're going to have some wear and tear. So, let's take a look at putting a lot of mileage on a car. If you put get a lot of miles in on your car, the tread on the tires is going to start to wear down. The fluids are going to start to get gunky. Some switches are going to break. The rubber on the windshield wipers are going to start to get all floppy and useless, and everything, you use your windshield wipers and everything just gets all smeary on your windshield. So these are just some examples of all the kinds of different things that break down with your car with normal use. And then what do you need to do? Well, if you don't want to hold your car together with duct tape, you need to actually fix some stuff. Well, cells break down. I mean, any machine breaks down, normal wear and tear. So just like a cell, just like a car, when it breaks down, sometimes you can recycle parts and just rebuild them, or sometimes you bring in brand new parts. So, for example, with the car, you could rebuild the carburetor, and cells will often do the same thing. Well, they will take parts of a broken cell and then break it down. So what again are our building blocks of a cell? Well, proteins. So if there's something broken in a cell, you can actually break those proteins down into their usable bits, which are amino acids. Those are the building blocks of proteins. And then all the amino acids aren't broken. You can actually take some of those amino acids and use them to rebuild whatever part of the cell was broken, or rebuild that carburetor instead of starting from scratch. Other times you need to take in brand new materials, like bring in some clean fluids. Other times you can just filter the fluids. And then reproduction is probably obvious to think about. If the cell doesn't reproduce, then when it dies, there goes the whole organism, as we all eventually make our way back to the old toilet bowl. So perhaps one of the first things you think about when you think about living organisms is that they're able to move. And when you think about movement, perhaps you think about bigger, or I guess a technical term would be bigger or gross movements. And if you think about the bigger movements, let's go back to the larger organism, or a human in this case, rather than individual cells. If you think about living things moving, you might think about us actually going from one spot to another, or your water sitting down on the desk and you want to drink the water, you pick that water up. What do you use to pick that water up? You use your muscles. Well, all cells, right down to the cellular level, have to have movement as well. Some individual cells can actually physically move around, like let's take the example of an amoeba. An amoeba is actually a single cell animal, and it can kind of roll around, like if you picture like a big floppy bag of water rolling down a hill. Well, amoebas can actually do that. Even if they weren't downhill, they can actually move around. But all the stuff inside cells actually needs to move around as well. And there's so many chemical reactions going on in a cell at any time, and these chemicals that are interacting are needing to slosh around in a water medium, and the proteins that are being made need to get out to where they are needed. So all this movement happens inside, in other words, intracellular, as well as outside the cells, or extracellular. And the responsiveness is actually integral to the movement, but may or may not be the first thing you think about. Responsiveness is your actual ability to respond to internal or external stimuli or changes in your environment. And each individual cell needs to be able to do that. So the inside the cell and outside the cell, the environment is constantly changing, whether it's the temperature, the different chemical levels, and your cell has to be able to respond to those changes to stay healthy and alive. Let's pretend that inside this cell here on the left, there was a fire. Let's pretend it got really hot in the room, or I can't draw a fire with this thing, but let's pretend it got really hot in the room, or there was this goldfish bowl. Somebody put it on a stove top, and the temperature was getting hotter and hotter. Well, those, sad little fish are going to die if they get stuck in that cell. Well, the cell's going to do the same thing. So this lucky little fish here can jump to the fish bowl that's at the correct temperature. This is actually a good segue to what could quite easily be argued as the most important concept in physiology, which is homeostasis. Homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain relatively constant internal environment. So where I was talking about the inside or intracellular and outside cell or extracellular environment constantly being exposed to changes, those changes can quite literally be deadly if the cell cannot respond to them and change. Now, one of the most common examples of homeostatic mechanisms to talk about is the ability to regulate or maintain a constant temperature. So let's take a look at the bigger organism again, like a human. So let's say we're outside on a freezing cold, snowy day, and we're outside for hours, and then all of a sudden we go inside to a tropically heated butterfly house. That's a huge temperature difference, and our body has to be able to respond to that temperature to stay healthy and alive. And on the cellular level, let's take a look at that. What again is the primary structural component of the body? It's proteins. Let's take a look at something we eat that has a lot of protein in it. Eggs have a lot of protein. Now, if you take an egg and you crack it in a bowl at room temperature, it's going to be, a pretty viscous, kind of oily, kind of a liquid. And that is very, very much what the intracellular fluid is like. It's very much like the consistency of egg white. And the egg is an actual protein like our cells. Well, now take that egg that you cracked and put it on a skillet on high heat. What's that egg consistency gonna do? It's gonna turn all rubbery. That is exactly what the proteins in the cells would do if they got too hot. They would literally get all rubbery and baked, just like the protein in an egg. So our body, when it's exposed to temperatures that are too hot, has to actually regulate them. Now, we're not, typically exposed to temperatures that are hot enough to literally bake our proteins, but on the more fine-tuned levels of temperature changes, our chemical reactions happen best at certain temperatures. And if they get too hot or too cold, they don't happen as well. You can see this with insects. For example, if you take a look at bee boxes or beehives, you could take a bunch of little towers of bee boxes sitting next to each other, and so sometimes as the sun, goes over some trees, and some of the bee boxes are in shade, and some of the bee boxes are in sunlight, you could see, this is pretty cool to watch, that the bee boxes that are in sunlight, it will literally warm up the bees, and the hive will get all active, and you'll start to see this flurry of activity of all the worker bees flying in and out, really active from the hives. And the bee boxes that are still in the shade, you'll see very few, if any, bees flying in and out. And chemical reactions in the body are like that too, that they happen usually faster when it gets warmer, but then it still has to be in a certain fine-tuned range where it doesn't get too hot or too cold. And how we maintain this homeostasis, the simplest as far as temperature goes, the simplest analogy that people often use is how a thermostat works in a house to maintain a temperature. And so it's connected to the heating unit. And if the temperature drops beyond the level that you've set, let's say you set your house at 70 degrees. If your house drops below 70 degrees, the thermostat will read that and send a signal to the heating unit, which will then trigger on and turn the heater on. But then if the thermostat reads that the temperature of the room has gotten hotter or higher than the 70 degrees that you set it at, then that will trigger the heater to turn off. Our body has similar sensory mechanisms to sense when things like our temperature are too high or too low, and then it has various mechanisms for regulating. And how it works in the body is something that we'll be talking about as we actually get to the different systems of the body, because it actually involves like a combined orchestration of different systems in the body working together to maintain the homeostatic level of temperature. But your body isn't just having to maintain the right temperature in each cell, it's having to maintain a fine-tuned range of many different things, such as the pH range, which you may know from a chemistry class at some point or another, is the acid or base level. So you may recall that pH, or acid to base, is on a scale from 0 to 14. And when you get 7's the midpoint, and when you get closer to 0, so between 0 and 7, that is more acidic or more acid. Things like vinegar and lemon, or pictured here, the tomato soup. When you get between the 7 and 14 range, that's more basic or more base. And your cells have to be in a certain pH range to have all the chemical reactions occur properly. There are just countless chemical reactions going on inside and outside all of your cells at all times. And the more you learn about anatomy and physiology, hopefully the more you'll begin to appreciate how many different chemical reactions are actually happening in each cell at a time. It's pretty phenomenal. And your cells, these actual reactions occur in certain pH ranges, and ions floating about will have a positive or negative charge that will influence the environment. And common in the body on the acidic range would be hydrogen ions. So they have a positive charge, and there are other ions floating about that have a positive charge in the body that plays a big role. And as we start to take a look at how things cross over the cellular membrane, oftentimes how this occurs is very much to do with the charges of things. But that's for a later date. Let's get back to homeostasis and the different things that the body needs to maintain in a certain, the cells need in a certain range. All sorts of different chemical levels also need to be within a certain range. A lot of what needs to happen for the body to stay healthy and for cells to stay happy and healthy is to maintain their boundaries. So let's pretend again that this fishbowl is a cell. It is vital to the cell's health that it is able to maintain the boundary of what stays inside the cell and what stays outside the cell. And this again segues into what I was talking a little bit about before, about what gets inside the cell membrane and what goes outside the cell membrane. This is such a crucial function in the body that the body actually uses 40%, approximately 40% of its energy just to purposefully determine what goes across the cell membrane, what can go in and what can go out. And when the body has to use energy to decide what goes in and out, that's called active transport. And we're going to talk about that in the next slideshow. Now that we've talked about the body repairing things, reproducing, building, all of these things to get this kind of work done, you need nutrients to get that work done. And in the body, we use things like proteins and fats and sugars like glucose or simpler complex carbohydrates, and then the body breaks all those nutrients down into the usable bits so that the cells can get the work done. And what is the work that they need to get done? They need to make proteins. Now there are a couple nutrients that are so vital that we're going to give them a little special airtime on their own, one of which being water. Now, inside and outside the cell, the body has a lot of water. How much of the body is actually water, and why is it so important? Well, you'll see different estimates in different textbooks, or if you search it online, and part of the reason you'll see different estimates is because how much water the body has in it actually varies depending on age and hydration and different factors. But you will often see estimates of 60 or even 70% of the body is made up of water. Why is water so important inside and outside of the cells? Well, one of the reasons is that there are so many chemical reactions going on that you need a fluid environment so that all of the different chemicals that need to react with each other to build stuff, they all need to actually be able to come in contact with each other. And so this watery fluid substance allows the different chemicals to actually come in contact with each other. But another reason that water is so important is that water actually maintains its temperature quite well. In other words, it takes quite a bit of energy to raise the temperature of water. And so therefore, it is actually a relatively stable, or in other words, it is kind of easier to maintain homeostasis because the water maintains its temperature, or it requires quite a bit of energy to change the temperature of water. There's actually a lot of other reasons the body needs water as well, and we will be taking a look at some of the chemistry as we go along. the body and our little fish in the fishbowl, our cells, each and every cell needs oxygen as well. Our little fish here is getting its oxygen in the water with the little air bubbles. Why is oxygen so important in cells? Well, we need oxygen as the easiest or preferred way of making energy. So if we need to get any work done, we've got our bottle of water on the table and we want to drink that water. To get that work done of lifting that water bottle up, we need to create some energy. And the body uses glucose and breaks it down into its preferred form of energy. And the way that the body makes energy is called cellular respiration or oxidative respiration. Now, you may take like a 10-unit anatomy and physiology or some higher level of organic chemistry and study how this actually works, but I'm not going to make you memorize the chemical equation, but it is useful to look at so that you can see some of the key parts. And there are parts of this, I'm not going to make you memorize the equation, but there are parts of it here that you should understand. So the body's happiest way of making energy is to take oxygen and glucose, a simple sugar, and then it's going to basically break that down into adenosine triphosphate, and then you're going to get the waste product of CO2 or carbon dioxide and water or H2O. Now, the body's favorite form of energy, and this you definitely need to know, it's going to come up time and time again in every system of the body, is ATP. What ATP stands for is adenosine triphosphate. The A for adenosine, T for tri, and P for phosphate. And you may recognize the prefix tri, meaning 3. And again, I'm not going to make you memorize all the chemistry of what goes on here, but you will see as we look at different chemical reactions and when the body uses ATP, as I mentioned, for active transport, moving things across the cellular membrane on purpose, it'll take this adenosine triphosphate, link to a cell membrane at a protein channel, and there'll be a conformational change or shape change in the protein, and then that little ATP gets kind of broken up and the energy breaks off or gets used, and so then you end up with ADP or adenosine diphosphate or 2 phosphates, and then that phosphate is used up. Well, how is that creating energy? Well, it's breaking a link, if you will. So there's a stored form of energy, which you may remember from some level of chemistry or physics, is kinetic energy. So the stored form of energy is kinetic energy. So if you have these links in the chemicals and you break those links, you can free up that energy and use that energy. It's sort of like, if we go back to the analogy of the Legos, if you have a Lego structure and you take apart or snap apart those Legos, that is requiring the use of energy and releasing energy. All right, so we're talking about using the body's favorite form of energy, which is ATP, to get work done. We've talked about the kind of work you get done, like repairing all the stuff that gets broken down. In a cell, let's go back to that repair slide. Close your eyes if this is going to make you dizzy here. But getting back to that repair slide, actually I'm going to go way back to the beginning here, because a perfect example of a cell, that needs to be repaired is a red blood cell. Why do red blood cells need to get repaired all the time? Well, red blood cells have a really big job to carry out. They have to get oxygen throughout the body, so they carry the oxygen. so they get tired out pretty quickly. Now, there are more red blood cells than any other cell in the body. They're the most abundant or prolific cell in the body. But they have this really big job to do, and so just like putting a ton of miles on your car, that car is going to get worn out. It's going to get those gunky fluids, the worn down tread on your tires, the broken switches, and just like that, the really big job on these red blood cells is going to make them wear out really quickly. Well, in fact, the red blood cells break down and actually die in about 120 days. Well, it also doesn't help that the red blood cells do not even have a nucleus, so they are anucleated. And so these red blood cells die about every 120 days or about every 4 months. So about 3 times a year you have brand new red blood cells or new blood. Now, it doesn't just happen 3 times a year like, oh, it's, red blood cell creating day. I mean, your body's actually repairing and creating these throughout the year. But if you think about how often these red blood cells are dying, your body is recreating them. Well, think about all these broken parts, all this gunky fluid in your car, all these broken parts you're getting rid of in your car, or these red blood cells that are dying down quickly. When you're repairing them and you're fixing them, what do you think happens to all the gunky fluid and all the stuff? Well, any cell or any machine that gets work done, any cell or any machine that gets work done has to create waste, and it has to get rid of its waste. Here we have a sad little fishbowl where the water hasn't been cleaned. And this actually reminds me of one of my daughter's favorite books, one of my 3-year-old's favorite books. I think it's called Everybody Poops. And, anytime, basically the animals, when they eat, the animals have to poop. And so cells are the same way. So all these jobs that they're doing, whether it's repair or whatnot, all the chemical reactions in the body are called metabolism. And metabolism is an important term to memorize and understand. Metabolism is basically the total or the sum of all of the physical and chemical processes that happen in an organism. And you basically have 2 different kinds, or 2 different phases or stages of metabolism. So anabolism is the constructing or the building phase. So going back to when we're talking about repairing or reproducing, when you actually take the Legos and put them together to build something, whereas the catabolism is the destructive phase or the breaking down phase. And both are equally important in the body, and both are happening all of the time. So every single little cell is constantly having things it's needing to build, which is called the anabolism, or break down, called catabolism. So the catabolism, or breaking down, I think easy thing to think about in the body as a whole would be when you take in food. So if you eat an apple, your teeth mechanically start to grind it down, and your stomach starts to mechanically grind it down and smush it up. So it first kind of gets like a applesauce, and then your body is dumping chemicals in, the saliva in your mouth, chemicals in your stomach, and then as it moves down through your small intestines and your large intestines, your pancreas and other organs are spilling in more digestive enzymes, which can break down the food into the smaller and smaller pieces until they're small enough for the body to actually use and absorb. Well, all of these different chemical reactions, they have waste products. So anytime you use energy, whether it's to build something up or to break something down, you're going to end up with waste products. And with our analogy of the fish bowl, here we have, the fish pooping in its fish bowl, and you have to clean the water. Unless you have a bigger fish tank and you've got, an automatic cleaner, or you got some Playcos in there that can do some of the cleanup themselves as well. But you have to clean that water because the cell, all these metabolic activities, the cell is pooping just like the fish is pooping. This actually reminds me of a friend and I were getting into a little bit of a movie critique, and we were talking about The Life of Pi, and she was talking about when he's in the boat, with all the animals, and how there's these animals eating each other, and there's no poop anywhere. So I guess nobody really wanted to be looking at poop in that scene, but the cells and the goldfish bowl and the animals that are eating each other all are creating waste products. And the cells need to get rid of those. And that takes energy too. A cell can't be alone, just like an island, just the expression no man is an island, no cell is an island. Again, if you think about how it needs to get rid of waste and how it's going to need new substances, it's going to need water, it's going to need nutrients, oxygen, those are some of the nutrients that it needs. The cell's going to need to communicate with other cells and the rest of the organism to actually get the substances it needs for repair and everything that it needs to get done. Now, that's just some of the things that a cell can do. When you start to think about how cells are in the body, it's pretty amazing. First of all, there's, it would be impossible to count all the cells in the body, but people estimate that there are about 75 to 100 trillion active living cells in the body, which is obviously way more than the Legos pictured here, but kind of gives us, a little idea of lots and lots and lots and lots of Legos. This is really cool. I've actually seen this in Legoland. But anyway, when you get into numbers as big as a trillion, almost everybody, it's just normal human nature to have a really hard time digesting or understanding a number like a trillion. So most of us, kind of glaze over once we start thinking about numbers that big. Let's break it down. I'm not a big person to make you memorize numbers, but on the other hand, I'm going to be trying to explain certain numbers as we come to them in the body because they're important to understand for the scheme of how the body works and the proportions of things. So when we talk about the size of a cell, it's in terms of microns. Well, what the heck is a micron? If a cell is like 60 to 80 or 100 microns big, what the heck does that mean? Well, it turns out it's about the biggest cell in the body, which is egg or an ovum. If you put a little tiny dot on a piece of paper, that's about how big the biggest cell would be. And so, that's in the terms of, roughly 100 microns. So when you think about how big cells are, that's, they're about the size of a speck of a dot on a paper or smaller. When you think about how many cells there are, what the heck is 100 trillion? Well, let's go back to some numbers that may make a little bit of sense and then actually try to explain them. Probably most people have a little bit of grasp on a million having 6 zeros, and then a billion has 9 zeros, and then a trillion has 12 zeros. So we're talking about 75 to 100 trillion. Well, talking about numbers of zeros, does that really let you picture how many cells there are? Maybe some of you, but you would not be alone if not. So I read one person's way of trying to explain really big numbers to kids, and I thought it was pretty cool. He explained numbers and tried to make a comparison to time. So if you think in terms of seconds, 1,000,000 seconds is about 11.5 days. And if you take 1,000,000,000 seconds, that takes about 32 years. And then 1,000,000,000,000 seconds takes about 32,000 years. And for me, what I was able to really put it together with of how to make this make sense is if you were actually physically counting all of the cells in the body and you counted them 1 second at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of roughly like that, it would take you 32,000 years to count the cells in the body. Well, maybe you can count faster than 1 cell a second. Let's say you can count 2 cells a second. I mean, you're still talking like, over 15,000 years to count all the cells in the body. So that's a lot of cells. And when we start to look at the chemistry and the processes of what's happening inside and outside of the cell, it's completely mind-blowing that it's all happening at all times, and that most of the time it happens without a hitch. And most of the time when there's a glitch in the system, your body fixes it. If there's a dysfunctional cell, your body knows how to fix it or kill it on purpose, which it has to do all the time. That's called auto-lyse, or self-destroy. All right, so let's take a look at the basic parts of a cell. The parts of a cell, when you talk about the parts, you're talking about the study of anatomy. So remember, the study of anatomy is the study of structure. In other words, the study of the parts. And then when you talk about how those parts work, or in other words, how they function, that's the study of physiology. So there's really just 3 basic parts to a cell membrane. Or excuse me, to a cell. The outside of a cell is a cell membrane. And this is a typical kind of basic cartoon-like diagram of a cell. And this outer, what you might think of as a shell, is the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Now, I said you might think of it as a shell, but actually, as we're really going to dive into in nice depth next slideshow, we'll see that it's actually made of a phospholipid bilayer. And it's got the word lipid in it, and lipid means fat. So it's actually like an oily film of fat with a lot of proteins embedded in it. And so it's actually much more like a soap bubble than a shell. And don't ever get confused and call it a cell wall, because only animals have walls. Excuse me, only, I said that backwards, only plants have walls. So, if you look at an onion layers under a microscope, you could see little boxy little walls. But in animals, they're membranes, and it's very much like a soap bubble. Inside the soap bubble membrane is a cytoplasm. A cytoplasm is a fluid matrix. It's got a lot of water in it, of course, but it has other substances floating in it too, and it's like a really rich, nutrient-rich substance, like a really nutrient-rich soup, like pho. And it's more viscous than water, like I was saying earlier. It's kind of like egg white. And then the command center Oh, and excuse me, inside the cytoplasm, that's the liquid part, you also have organelles. Organelles are like little itty-bitty, microscopic factories. So in this diagram, a lot of what's labeled here are organelles. The example, rough endoplasmic reticulum, ribosomes, lysosomes, and so on. Oh, Golgi bodies. Here we go. In a couple slideshows, we're going to take a look at the different organelles and their functions. The kind of specialized command center of the cell is the nucleus. And as I mentioned before, this of course has the genetic code, the DNA, which is like a blueprint, and that blueprint codes for proteins. So when the body needs to make proteins, whether it's to repair something or make a substance like insulin or hormones, the nucleus, the command center of the cell, will use its code to teach all these other organelles or give all these other organelles directions on how to actually build that protein, which sometimes is used inside the cell and then sometimes is exported outside of the cell. We'll come back to how all these parts work in the next couple of slideshows. Now, this little cartoon-like diagram is very typical, and it shows kind of roughly a circular cell, and perhaps you sort of have that image in your mind of what cells look like. In the body, there's over 200 different kinds of cells, and very few of them are actually round like that, like the the picture on the previous cell. Here's an example of a cell that's pretty close to round. It's a fat cell, and most of this big round part here is actually just storing the fat, and then little organelles are squished here over to the side. But here are some cartoon-like representation of some of the other types of cells in the body, and you can see none of them are actually round. Of the 200 plus different kinds of cells in the body, we have some cells with some very long, skinny projections, like the nerve cell. In fact, some of the nerve cells, these long, skinny parts, these axons here, could be as long as your thigh. Actually, a few of them are even longer than that. So sometimes that little long projection is really long. You have little boxy, cube, square kind of cells. You can line structures on your body with little boxy cube cells. Sometimes they excrete substances like sweat or oil, or sometimes they line the outside and inside of structures for protection, and all kinds of different kinds of cells. Here's a little macrophage. That's a type of a white blood cell that can actually have that sort of amoeba or amoeboid-like action I was telling you about earlier. If you picture a soft sack full of water or a plastic bag full of water, and it kind of can like roll around all on its own accord, macrophages can cruise around the body like that and actually find little bacteria and debris and break them down. You may recognize this cell that's red and has a biconcave disc shape up here, but you may or may not recognize the name here. Erythrocyte is the fancy word for red blood cell, which is often abbreviated RBCs. You already know a couple cool things about red blood cells. They are the most abundant cell in the body, and they do not have nuclei. They are anucleated. We will be taking a look at all of these cells as we look at each system of the body, but what you basically do is take different types of cells and they function together like a team, and you get different cells working together as a team to make different types of tissues. And there's really only 4 major types of tissues in the body that create the entire body and get all of the work of the body done. There's some really cool way that the shapes of these cells actually determine what job they do. And there's a concept in anatomy and physiology basically that structure determines function. So in other words, these cells are not, they don't have these shapes randomly. They actually have these shapes for the very purpose that they are doing. For example, if you want to transmit a quick signal for that function we were talking about where the cells have to be responsive, and they have to be able to communicate with each other. If you want to send a quick signal way across the body really, really fast, then it might make sense to have a super long projection. And it turns out you can actually use an electrical signal across this long projection to send that signal super, super fast. And all of these different shapes are sort of brilliantly designed to optimally do their job. In the case of our little RBCs, our little red blood cells or erythrocytes, this little lifesaver or barbell shape, this biconcave disc, has a beautiful design that we will be seeing and discussing as a concept and examples throughout the body, not just of this biconcave disc shape, but of a lot of shapes. There's a reason why it's shaped, and here we have a side view of the biconcave disc. There's a reason why it has that biconcave disc instead of, let's say, for example, just straight up round. Or let's say, hey, this red blood cell, it's making oxygen move around the body. Well, why make a bunch of little teeny tiny red blood cells? Why not make one gigantic red blood cell? Well, the shape of these little red blood cells is actually optimally designed to increase the surface area so that we can diffuse the oxygen and get the oxygen in and out of those little, red blood cells as necessary. So get the oxygen out of the red blood cells into the cells, and then pick up the waste products, the carbon dioxide. So we can get the oxygen out of the red blood cell into the body, and then pick up the wastes or the CO2. And so this particular shape increases the surface area, so you're going to have more diffusion able to happen on the surface of every little one of those red blood cells, instead of making it just circular, or instead of just making it really big. We'll come back and look at that as a concept and specific examples as we travel throughout the body. It so happens that this particular shape also lets these little erythrocytes squeeze into teeny spaces, and we're going to see they squeeze single file into the capillaries to diffuse that oxygen. And we'll actually see some erythrocytes actually in action and changing shape, and it's pretty cool. So where are we going to go next with this? You may think about the outside of a cell as sort of just being like, oh, big deal, it's just the outside of the cell, it's just like a wall or whatnot. But it's actually one of the most important parts of a cell. As I started talking about what gets into the cell and what goes out of the cell is of utmost importance to that cell's ability to do its job and to stay healthy and to even stay alive. And so in the next slideshow, we're going to take a look at exactly how that cellular membrane is constructed and how substances cross that cellular membrane. And we're going to get into passive methods like diffusion and osmosis, and we're going to get into active methods that take the use of energy, like active transport and the different types of active transport. Here's a kind of a typical cartoon diagram of sort of a cell membrane, and just as a little preview, cell membranes are completely amazing and cool, and I was talking about them being a phospholipid bilayer, the lipid for fat, and bi for two. So it's like a double layer of soap. If we could have a soap bubble that actually had a soap bubble right inside of a soap bubble touching each other, that would be this phospholipid bilayer. And it is really, the lipid part is really exactly like a soap bubble. Well, why do they not just then pop? Why are they not quite that flexible as a soap bubble? Well, they have a lot of proteins in them. And proteins are integral to the structure of a cell. And those of you that are ahead of me know that is a very bad pun, because actually traversing the phospholipid bilayer, we have integral proteins. We also have proteins that go on the cell and stick out of the cell. And these little proteins that stick out of the cell, they have glyco, like glycogen at the beginning, or the prefix. And that's like sugar. So it's actually, you can actually think of our cells as being sugar-coated. And those little sugar-coating glycogens, those are actually our little flags that say, hey, this is what kind of cell I am. But there's all kinds of cool functions about the cell membrane, and that's where we're going to go next. Last thing I want to show you today is a cool animation of what happens inside of a cell. And this animation is not narrated, and it may just kind of look like a sci-fi movie, but the more you know about cells, the more you can see that actually what's going on in these crazy sci-fi little ships taking off and landing and all this crazy stuff happening is a lot like what happens inside of a cell. And then when you start to think about how there's 75 to 100 trillion of them, and that all these processes are happening at the same time, hopefully you'll start to really appreciate how beautiful and complex and amazing the anatomy and physiology of the human body is.